Welcome to our unrestful union. We are going to look at the Colfax Massacre, an incident from Reconstruction. This took place in the town of Colfax, Louisiana, on April 13, 1873, when nearly 100 blacks were killed by a militia of white Democrats. This massacre was the result of racism, disenfranchisement, and government corruption. Let's take a look at the national political situation in 1873. The Civil War had ended 8 years ago, and the country was still very divided. The Republican Party was no exception to this. They fractured over the re-election of President Grant, the breakaway faction calling themselves liberal Republicans. They wanted an end to Reconstruction and disagreed with how heavily Grant was enforcing civil rights law. The Democrats, who were still bitter over their loss of the Civil War, found common cause with the liberal Republicans in their opposition to Grant's policies. The fusion of these two groups created some weird situations, such as the Republican governor of Louisiana backing the Democrat candidate for his office. But more on that in a bit. Adding to this, claims of voter fraud were rife in the southern states, with the electoral votes from Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas being contested in the Senate. The votes from Arkansas and Louisiana were ultimately invalidated because of voter fraud. Zooming in on Louisiana, an interesting political situation had developed around the gubernatorial election of 1872. The Republican governor, Henry WARMOTH, believed Grant was out to get him, which soured his relations with the president. This meant when Grant threw his support behind William Kellogg, the Republican gubernatorial candidate, WARMOTH threw his behind the Democrat candidate, John McHenry. And this support included that of the state returning board that WARMOTH had created earlier in his term to oversee elections. The Republicans had previously used this board to stay in power by miscounting ballots in their favor. At WARMOTH's direction, the returning board declared McHenry the winner. This prompted the Republicans to set up a separate returning board called the Lynch Returning Board, and they declared Kellogg the winner. With both candidates declaring victory and the power of the state behind McHenry, Kellogg went to federal court with complaints of voter fraud. This fell under the jurisdiction of Judge Edward Durrell for the District of Louisiana. He ruled the state returning board results invalid and affirmed Kellogg as the winner of the election. The Republican state legislature, feeling betrayed by WARMOTH, impeached him for election fraud. This removed him from office and elevated his lieutenant governor, Pinckney Pinchback, to the governorship. Pinchback is the first black man to hold a governorship in American history, albeit only for 35 days. He didn't have anything against Grant, so he supported Kellogg's victory. Despite Kellogg being officially declared governor by Judge Durrell, McHenry still declared himself governor and held his own swearing-in ceremony. In a speech on April 19th that was summarized by the Ouachita Telegraph, McHenry detailed how Kellogg stole the election from him. Kellogg at last said, "I have it. We have a U.S. judge who is a partisan, who is with us. He will give us relief on any showing." The whole machinery was put in motion, and at the dead hour of night, after Judge Durrell had reeled home from his cups, from a feast to which the conspirators had invited him, in his chamber, his mind and body paralyzed and unfitted by intoxication, by one stroke of his pen, attempted to sweep away the liberties of the people of the state of Louisiana, to degrade the proud state, to drag her down, and place her people under the iron heel of a stranger, a usurper. Hence the necessity of the people to be united, to be firm and confident, and in no way recognize the Kellogg government, but to resist it by all constitutional and legal means. We are engaged in a great moral battle, probably the last that may be fought for American freedom, and if we succeed, to Louisiana would belong the glory of having been the battleground, and it will redound to her everlasting glory. Even though this speech was a few days after the massacre, it demonstrates how the Democrats viewed the election. They felt as though their freedom was being taken away. Looking at the broader context of the time, President Grant hadn't taken the army out of Louisiana since the war ended, and used this power to maintain control in the southern states. This, on top of corruption employed by Republicans to keep Democrats out of power, made them disenfranchised. This disenfranchisement was done in the name of civil rights, because the moment the Democrats got back into power in the 1870s, they rolled them back as much as they could. Racial tensions were brewed up due to the fact that blacks were overwhelmingly Republican. All their anger at the Republicans ended up directed at the blacks, who were simply defending themselves and what they saw as a rightful government of Louisiana. In the town of Colfax, Fusionist candidates for judge and sheriff of Grant Parish had won their elections according to the state returning board. These offices, however, were technically vacant due to Judge Jarrell's order for the board to cease its activities. Kellogg made appointments to fill these offices, but the Fusionists refused to leave. Republicans, mostly black men from the local area, formed a militia and forced them out. Fearing a violent response from Democrats, the Republican militia entrenched themselves in and around the courthouse. Earlier in April, clashes had broken out between whites and blacks after a group of black men allegedly assaulted and robbed a judge. The local newspapers declared this rioting, and they claimed that the blacks were pillaging and terrorizing the whites in the area. So, when the blacks took over the courthouse from the Fusionists, a group of roughly 150 whites from Colfax and the surrounding area, thinking a violent mob of blacks had claimed the town for themselves, formed a militia and assaulted the courthouse on April 13th. Here's what the Ouachita Telegraph reported about the incident. On Sunday, April 13th, about 12 p.m., 150 whites who had gathered from the surrounding parishes made an attack on the breastworks, and a brisk fight was kept up until near 3 p.m. The breastworks were then stormed and captured, the Negroes taking refuge in the courthouse, the door of which were barricaded. After some further fighting, the Negroes threw out a flag of truce and several men advanced on it, when they were fired upon by the besieged party, wounding several, one of whom is feared fatally. They retreated on the breastworks, and, as the only means of dislodging the Negroes, the courthouse was set on fire, and they were shot as they came from the burning building. It is reported that between 80 and 100 Negroes were killed, and that there were none to be found for miles around. What this explanation leaves out is that a large number of blacks had been captured, and that they suffered greatly at the hands of the white militia. U.S. District Attorney James Beckworth said after the massacre, 30 blacks were known to have been taken prisoners, are said to have been shot after surrender, and then thrown in the river. 97 members of the Democrat militia were indicted for the massacre, but not for murder. They were charged with violating the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, meaning they had violated the rights of the blacks who were killed. The prosecutors believed if they tried them for murder in the Louisiana courts, which were dominated by Democrats, they would get off scot-free. Charging them under the Enforcement Acts sent the case to federal court, where they would receive more favorable treatment from federal judges. Of the 97, only the 3 who organized the militia were found guilty. They then appealed their case to the Supreme Court, claiming the federal government had no jurisdiction. This case became United States v. Cherikshank. The prosecutors claimed the defendants had violated 3 rights granted by the Constitution to the murdered blacks: the right to bear arms, peaceably assemble, and not be deprived of life or liberty without due process under the law. Despite the best efforts of the prosecutors, the perpetrators of the massacre were not punished for their actions, because the court sided with the defendants. They ruled since this involved private parties and not state actors, the federal government had no jurisdiction, and this was up to the state courts to decide. This precedent neutered the federal government's ability to use the Enforcement Acts to effectively enforce civil rights laws. It wasn't until the Supreme Court case of Ex parte Yarborough in 1884 that the Enforcement Acts could apply to non-state actors. The massacre, what led to it, and its aftermath are the result of a breakdown in our electoral system. The Republicans, wanting to ensure the safety of blacks in the former Confederate states, used corruption and disenfranchisement to stay in power. In Louisiana, the Democrats tried employing the same corruption to retake power, only to be thwarted by the state legislature and the federal government. This caused tensions between the two parties to grow, until they exploded in the Colfax Massacre, leading to the death of about 100 blacks. The Supreme Court case that came in the aftermath, United States v. Cherikshank, resulted in the neutering of the Enforcement Acts because the prosecutors misused them. This series of events is exactly why we must ensure our elections are fair. Anything can come out of the chaos of a contested election.